This is first class, not a charity case. Turn around." Captain James Wellington's voice cut through the Boeing 787's cabin like a blade through silk. His silver hair gleamed under the aircraft's LED lighting, 4 gold stripes on his shoulders, catching the light as he positioned himself like a human barricade in the doorway. His steel blue eyes locked onto Victoria Coleman, a 42-year-old black woman in faded jeans and a Northwestern University hoodie, and he saw exactly what he expected to see, a problem that needed to be solved. Victoria stood at the threshold between the jet bridge and first class, her boarding pass in hand, her expression calm as still water. She didn't flinch. She'd been here before, not physically but emotionally. The dismissal, the assumption, the instant judgment, based on nothing more than the color of her skin and the casual clothes she wore. Captain Victoria said, her voice steady and clear, "This seat is mine. I'm not asking permission. I'm stating a fact." Before we see this captain learn the hardest lesson of his career, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged by your appearance alone? Have you ever walked into a space where someone decided you didn't belong before you even opened your mouth? If so, this story is for you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe dignity should be standard for every passenger, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, prejudice, and justice at 30,000 feet. Wellington's jaw tightened. In his 20 years of flying, he'd developed what he considered a sixth sense about passengers. The real first-class travelers, the ones who belonged, carried themselves differently. They wore expensive watches, designer shoes, spoke with the confident authority that came from years of privilege. This woman, with her quiet demeanor and student-like appearance, didn't fit his mental profile. "Let me see that boarding pass." Wellington demanded, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor by even acknowledging her presence. Victoria held up her phone, the digital boarding pass glowing on the screen. "Seat 2A. First class, premium service, purchased with cash 3 days ago for $6,247. "Victoria Mills," she said clearly, using her maiden name, the name she'd used to book the flight specifically because it wouldn't raise flags in the corporate directory. Seat 2A. Wellington squinted at the screen without really looking at it. His mind had already made its decision. In his world, there were first-class passengers, and there were people trying to game the game. This woman, regardless of what her boarding pass said, belonged in the second category. "System's been glitchy all morning." Wellington said a lie that rolled off his tongue as easily as his morning coffee order. "I'm showing seat 2A as occupied by a confirmed passenger." "Not." He paused, letting his eyes travel from her sneakers to her hoodie, whatever this is. Victoria felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger, she'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in moments like this. It was something deeper. Determination. The same feeling that had carried her through Harvard Business School when professors assumed she was there on affirmative action. The same steel that had driven her through 15 years of climbing corporate ladders in boardrooms where she was often the only woman, the only black face, the only person whose authority was questioned before she even spoke. Captain Wellington Victoria said, her voice dropping to a register that commanded attention. "I suggest you scan that boarding pass properly." Around them, the morning energy of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 hummed with its usual chaos. Passengers streamed past the gate, dragging carry-ons, juggling coffee cups and phones. Most were focused on their own travel drama, but a few had begun to notice the standoff at the aircraft door. Wellington bristled. 20 years of flying had earned him respect deference, the kind of automatic authority that came with 4 stripes and a captain's wings. He wasn't accustomed to passengers, especially passengers who looked like her, speaking to him with anything approaching challenge in their voice. "Miss Wellington," said, emphasizing the word like a slap, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is my aircraft. I decide who boards and who doesn't. And I'm telling you that seat is not yours." Victoria nodded slowly, as if she was processing information rather than absorbing insults. Behind Wellington, she could see into the first-class cabin. Plush leather seats, passengers already settled with champagne and newspapers, the quiet luxury that she'd paid for and earned the right to experience. In seat 1A, she spotted a familiar figure, Robert Kensington, a frequent flyer she recognized from the executive briefings. Wellington had practically bowed when Kensington boarded 5 minutes earlier, calling him by name, asking about his family, ensuring his drink preferences were noted. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Captain Victoria said, pulling out her phone, "I'm going to make a quick call." Wellington scoffed. "Call whoever you want. Security will sort this out." Victoria tapped a number she knew by heart. 2 rings, then a crisp, professional voice answered. "Lisa Romano's Skyline Airways Executive Office." Victoria kept her voice low but clear enough for Wellington to hear. "Lisa, it's Victoria. Activate Protocol 7. On the other end of the line, Lisa Romano, Victoria's executive assistant, and one of only 3 people who knew Victoria's true identity, didn't hesitate. "Understood. Standing by for authorization." Wellington was still talking something about manifest errors and proper procedures, but Victoria was no longer listening. She was thinking about another moment, 18 years ago, when she'd walked into a boutique hotel in Atlanta wearing jeans and a backpack after a red-eye flight. The man at the front desk had looked her up and down and declared the reservation system temporarily down. She'd slept in her rental car that night, using the dashboard light to work on a business plan that would eventually become the foundation of her consulting empire. That night had taught her something crucial. Power wasn't about demanding respect. It was about being so undeniably competent that disrespect became impossible to maintain. Captain Victoria said, ending the call and looking directly into Wellington's eyes, "You're about to learn something important about assumptions." The trouble had actually started 30 minutes earlier at Gate K-12, where Carmen Valdez was having what she considered a perfectly normal Tuesday morning until Victoria Coleman walked up to her counter. Carmen, 29 years old, with perfectly manicured nails and an attitude that suggested the world existed primarily to inconvenience her, was processing the first-class boarding queue with practiced efficiency. She smiled broadly at each expensive suit, each platinum medallion member, each passenger whose appearance matched her mental catalog of people who belong here. Then Victoria approached the counter. Carmen's smile evaporated like morning dew. She looked Victoria up and down, faded jeans, sneakers that had seen better days, a Northwestern hoodie that belonged in a college dorm, not a first-class cabin. Her brain immediately categorized Victoria as a problem waiting to happen. "Zone 1 only," Carmen announced loudly, as if Victoria might be confused about basic boarding procedures. "Economy boarding starts in 20 minutes. Victoria extended her phone, the boarding pass clearly visible on the screen. "I am Zone 1. Carmen's expression shifted from dismissive to suspicious. She'd seen this before: people with upgraded passes they'd won in contests, employee benefits that let them taste luxury they couldn't afford, various schemes to sneak into cabins where they didn't belong. She snatched Victoria's phone from her hand, her acrylic nails clicking against the screen. The scanner beeped green. "First class. Seat 2A. Paid fare." Carmen frowned at the screen, then back at Victoria, then at the screen again. She typed something into her keyboard, her fingers moving with the aggressive precision of someone hoping to find a problem to solve. "System says." "First class," Carmen muttered, sounding personally offended by this information. "When did you book this? 3 days ago?" Victoria replied, her patience already wearing thin. "Is there a problem? We've been having issues with fraudulent bookings." Carmen said, her voice loud enough to draw attention from other passengers. "Stolen credit cards, fake confirmations. You understand we have to be careful." Behind Victoria, the gate area was filling with passengers waiting to board. Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old marketing executive in an expensive blazer, looked up from her laptop. She'd been half listening to the conversation, but Carmen's tone made her pay closer attention. Jake Anderson, a 24-year-old social media influencer with 200,000 followers, instinctively reached for his phone. His content focused on travel experiences and social justice, and his gut was telling him something worth documenting was about to happen. "Can you verify the payment method?" Carmen asked, still holding Victoria's phone like it might contaminate her. Victoria's voice stayed level. "I paid cash. Is there a specific reason you're questioning my ticket?" Carmen's eyes narrowed. "Cash payments sometimes flag in our security protocols. We've had problems with people using different names, stolen identities, that sort of thing." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Sarah Mitchell closed her laptop and started paying closer attention. Jake Anderson quietly opened his camera app. "I see," Victoria said, making a mental note. "First, checkpoint racial profiling at the gate. Check training logs for Carmen Valdez. Review security protocols for discriminatory language." An elderly Hispanic woman named Maria Santos waiting in the zone. 2 lines shook her head in disgust. She'd been flying for 40 years and had never seen a gate agent interrogate a first-class passenger about payment methods. "Are you going to scan my boarding pass or not?" Victoria asked. Carmen reluctantly processed the pass, the scanner beeping its approval. She handed the phone back with obvious reluctance. "Gate B6, next." But as Victoria walked toward the jet bridge, Carmen called out loud enough for half the gate area to hear security's been notified about potential booking irregularities on this flight. Victoria stopped walking. She turned back to face Carmen, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying a weight that made Carmen suddenly uncomfortable. "What did you just say?" Carmen, realizing she might have overplayed. Her hand backtracked slightly. "Standard procedure for flagged transactions. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal," Victoria repeated. She looked around the gate area, noting the passengers who were now openly staring. Sarah Mitchell, Jake Anderson, Maria Santos, several others who had witnessed the entire exchange. Victoria pulled out her phone again and made another note. "Carmen Valdez, Gate Agent ID Badge, 4127. Discriminatory treatment documented. Witnesses present." Sarah Mitchell stood up from her seat and approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said to Carmen, "but I've been sitting here for an hour and I haven't seen you question anyone else about their payment method or call security about booking irregularities." What exactly was irregular about her booking? Carmen's face flushed. "Ma'am, I can't discuss other passengers' travel details." "You just did," Sarah pointed out. Loudly, in front of everyone. Jake Anderson had his phone out now, not recording yet, but ready. His instincts as a content creator were screaming that something significant was unfolding. Victoria looked at Sarah with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for speaking up. This isn't right," Maria Santos added, approaching the counter. "I've been flying since before you were born, young lady, and I've never seen a gate agent treat a first-class passenger like a criminal." Carmen was now facing a small crowd of passengers who had witnessed her behavior. Her supervisor was nowhere in sight, and she was beginning to realize she might have made a mistake. "If there's nothing else," Victoria said, "I'd like to board my flight." She walked toward the jet bridge, leaving Carmen to face the quiet judgment of passengers who had seen enough to know what they'd witnessed. Sarah Mitchell returned to her seat, but kept her phone handy. Jake Anderson followed Victoria toward the boarding area, his content creator instincts telling him this story wasn't over. Maria Santos approached Carmen's counter one more time. "Mija," she said softly, "you need to think about why you treated that woman differently than everyone else, because the rest of us noticed." As Victoria walked down the jet bridge, she could feel the eyes on her back, some curious, some supportive, some simply uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed. She pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to Lisa Romano, initial contact problematic. Documentation in progress. Stand by for escalation. The response came back immediately. Understood. Full support ready. Victoria took a deep breath and approached the aircraft door where Captain James Wellington was waiting to greet first-class passengers with his trademark charm. She had no idea that her real test was about to begin. Captain James Wellington prided himself on being a student of human nature. In 20 years of flying, he'd developed what he considered an infallible ability to read passengers the moment they stepped onto his aircraft. The way they carried themselves, the quality of their accessories, the confidence in their voice, these were the markers that separated the truly elite from the pretenders. Standing at the entrance of Skyline Airways Flight 847, Wellington greeted each first-class passenger with practiced precision. Robert Kensington, the oil executive in the custom-tailored suit, received a firm handshake and personal attention. "Mr. Kensington, welcome aboard. I've made sure the cabin temperature is set exactly as you prefer, and Chef Rodriguez prepared that Scottish salmon you enjoyed last month." "Excellent, James. Always a pleasure flying with you." Kensington's response was warm, familiar, the easy interaction between two men who understood their positions in the world's hierarchy. Wellington adjusted his tie, the 4 gold stripes on his epaulets catching the cabin light. He'd worked 2 decades to earn those stripes, climbing from regional airlines to major carriers, building a reputation as one of Skyline's most reliable captains. His aircraft, his rules, his kingdom at 40,000 feet. Margaret Williams, a federal judge in an elegant navy dress, approached next. Wellington's greeting was appropriately respectful but warm. "Your Honor, always an honor to have you aboard. First Officer Kim has prepared the cabin lighting to minimize glare for your reading." "Thank you, Captain. Your attention to detail is why I always book Skyline." This was how it was supposed to work. Mutual respect between professionals. Recognition of status and achievement. The smooth operation of a world where everyone knew their place and played their role. Then Victoria Coleman stepped through the doorway. Wellington's practiced smile faltered. His eyes conducted their usual assessment. Faded jeans, sneakers that belonged in a gym, a hoodie that screamed student rather than success. Everything about her appearance contradicted his expectations for a first-class passenger. His brain immediately began processing alternatives. Employee pass holder, but those were usually announced in advance. Contest winner possible but unlikely on a Tuesday morning business flight. Upgrade due to overbooking, but that would have been noted in his pre-flight briefing. "Good morning," Victoria said, her voice clear and confident as she attempted to step past him toward the left aisle where the first-class suites were located. Wellington's arm shot out, creating a human barrier across the doorway. The movement was smooth practice, the gesture of someone accustomed to controlling access to exclusive spaces. "Hold on there," Wellington said, his voice shifting from the warm baritone he'd used with Kensington to something sharper, more authoritative. "Wrong direction." Victoria stopped looking at the arm, blocking her path. She looked up at Wellington, noting the change in his demeanor, the way his eyes had hardened, the subtle shift in his posture that suggested challenge rather than welcome. "Excuse me," Victoria said. "Economy boarding is to the right," Wellington explained, pointing his thumb toward the main cabin. "You're holding up the first-class passengers." Victoria held up her phone, the boarding pass clearly visible. "I'm in seat 2A, Captain. That's to the left." Wellington didn't look at the phone. He was looking at her face, her clothes, running his mental calculations and coming to the conclusion that made sense to him. Sometimes passengers got confused. Sometimes upgrades got processed incorrectly. Sometimes people tried to game the game. "Let me see that," Wellington said, reaching for her phone. Victoria hesitated for a moment, then handed it over. This was the second time in 30 minutes that a Skyline employee had demanded to examine her legitimate boarding pass, as if it were evidence in a criminal investigation. Wellington stared at the screen, not scanning the QR code, just reading the information with the expression of someone expecting to find fraud. Victoria Mills, he read aloud, testing the name as if it might reveal its secrets. And you're telling me you paid for a $6,000 ticket for a Tuesday morning flight to London? I'm telling you that is my boarding pass, Victoria replied, her patience beginning to thin. And I would like to take my seat. Behind Victoria, other passengers were beginning to notice the holdup. Sarah Mitchell, who had witnessed the gate interaction, was approaching with her carry-on. Jake Anderson was a few passengers back, his phone now discreetly recording. I don't think so, Wellington said, handing the phone back without moving his arm from the doorway. We've got a manifest issue. I'm showing seat 2A as occupied by a confirmed passenger. Occupied by me, Victoria said. No. Wellington stepped closer, using his height and position to create psychological pressure. Occupied by a paying customer, not someone working a system error or holding a buddy pass. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. In her mental notebook, she added another entry. Captain James Wellington, employee ID. Unknown discriminatory language, abuse of authority, false claims about manifest discrepancies. Captain Victoria said, her voice staying level despite the fury building in her chest. I suggest you check your manifest more carefully. Wellington's expression hardened. In his world, passengers didn't give suggestions to captains. They said yes, sir, and followed instructions and appreciated the privilege of flying on his aircraft. Miss Wellington said, the title carrying the weight of dismissal. I've been flying for 20 years. I know how to read a manifest, and I know when someone is trying to put something over on me. Behind Victoria, Sarah Mitchell cleared her throat. Excuse me, Captain, but is there a problem? I was in the gate area and saw this passenger's boarding pass scanned correctly. Wellington turned his attention to Sarah, immediately noting her expensive blazer, her confident posture, her obvious belonging in the first-class cabin. Ma'am, sometimes there are technical issues with the boarding system. I'm just verifying everything is correct. Her boarding pass says 2A. Sarah pointed out. What's to verify? Jake Anderson stepped closer, his phone now openly recording. This is interesting, he murmured to his camera. Passenger with valid first-class boarding pass being denied entry by captain. Wellington noticed the phone and his expression darkened. Sir, recording on the aircraft without permission violates federal regulations. Actually, Jake replied, I'm still technically on the jet bridge, which is considered terminal space, not aircraft space, and this seems like something the public should see. Victoria watched this exchange with growing clarity. Wellington's behavior wasn't random or confused. It was deliberate. He had made a decision about who she was based on her appearance, and he was now committed to that decision, regardless of evidence to the contrary. She pulled out her phone and dialed Lisa Romano's direct number. Lisa, it's Victoria. We're moving to Protocol 7 Alpha. Wellington overheard the call and scoffed. Ma'am, calling your friend isn't going to change the manifest. Victoria looked directly into his eyes. Captain Wellington, you're about to learn something important about assumptions, and about who exactly you're talking to. The words carried a weight that made Wellington pause for the first time since the conversation began. There was something in her voice, something in her eyes that didn't match his assessment of her as a confused passenger or opportunistic fraud. But he was too committed to his position to back down now. Miss Wellington said, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I contact security. Victoria nodded slowly. Do that, Captain. Contact security. In fact, contact everyone you think can help you, because you're going to need all the help you can get. Wellington reached for the aircraft phone with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about passengers, never been challenged by someone who mattered, never found himself in a situation where his authority was genuinely questioned. He was about to learn that confidence and competence were not the same thing. Tower, this is Skyline 847. Wellington spoke into the handset, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 20 years in the cockpit. I need ground security to Gate B6 for a passenger issue, possible fraudulent boarding pass. Victoria stood perfectly still, watching Wellington create what would become the most expensive phone call of his career. Behind her, the jet bridge was filling with passengers who had witnessed the gate interaction and were now seeing its continuation. The crowd was no longer casual observers, they were becoming invested witnesses. Sarah Mitchell positioned herself where she could see and hear everything clearly. As a marketing executive who had spent years navigating corporate politics, she recognized the dynamics at play. This wasn't about manifest errors or security protocols. This was about power being used to humiliate someone who didn't fit expectations. Jake Anderson had his phone at the perfect angle to capture both Wellington's authoritative posture and Victoria's calm dignity. His live stream was approaching 300 viewers, and the comments were beginning to reflect the audience's growing understanding of what they were watching. This is discrimination typed 1 viewer. Captain is about to learn a hard lesson, typed another. Maria Santos, the elderly Hispanic woman from the gate area, had made her way down the jet bridge and was now part of the gathering crowd. Her 40 years of flying experience had taught her to recognize abuse of power when she saw it. Wellington hung up the phone and turned back to Victoria with satisfaction. Security will sort this out. You can explain to them how you got hold of someone else's boarding pass. Someone else's boarding pass. Victoria repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous calm. You heard me. Wellington doubled down. People like you don't just wake up one morning and decide to drop $6,000 on a first-class ticket to London. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. People like you. 4 words that revealed everything about Wellington's worldview, his assumptions, his character. Sarah Mitchell audibly gasped. Did he just say what I think he said? Jake Anderson's live stream exploded with comments. The viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the stream across social media platforms. People like me, Victoria repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. Captain Wellington, would you mind elaborating on exactly what you mean by people like me? Wellington realized he might have revealed more than he intended, but he was too committed to his position to retreat. Look, miss, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is my aircraft. I decide who boards and who doesn't. And something about your story doesn't add up. What specifically doesn't add up? Victoria asked. Wellington gestured at her clothes, her appearance, her presence in his first-class cabin. Everything. The way you're dressed, the way you're acting like you belong here. The fact that you're arguing with me instead of accepting that there's been a mistake. So you're saying that my appearance determines my right to board this aircraft. I'm saying that in 20 years of flying, I've learned to spot inconsistencies. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his response. And in your professional opinion, what about my appearance is inconsistent with being a first-class passenger? The question was a trap, and Wellington was walking straight into it. Every answer he could give would further reveal his bias, further document his discrimination, further provide evidence for what was about to become a very serious conversation with corporate headquarters. First-class passengers dress appropriately, Wellington said. They understand the standards, the expectations. They don't show up in... He gestured dismissively at her hoodie and whatever this is. Maria Santos couldn't contain herself any longer. Captain, I've been flying since before you got your license, and I've never heard such nonsense. Since when is there a dress code for first class? Wellington turned his attention to Maria, immediately noting her age, her obvious status as a long-term frequent flyer. Ma'am, with respect, this doesn't concern you. It concerns every passenger on this aircraft, Maria shot back. If you can deny boarding to someone with a valid ticket because you don't like their clothes, none of us are safe from your prejudices. The crowd of witnesses was growing. Other first-class passengers who had already boarded were beginning to peer out of the cabin, curious about the commotion. Robert Kensington appeared in the doorway. His expensive suit perfectly pressed his expression one of mild annoyance. James, what's the holdup? We're already running behind schedule. Wellington felt the pressure of disappointing a valued passenger. "Just sorting out a boarding issue, Mr. Kensington. Won't be much longer." Kensington looked at Victoria, then at Wellington, then at the crowd of passengers with phones out. His years in corporate leadership had taught him to recognize public relations disasters in the making. "Perhaps this could be resolved more quietly," Kensington suggested. "The lady refuses to accept that there's been an error," Wellington explained. Victoria spoke directly to Kensington. "Sir, I have a valid boarding pass for seat 2A. The captain is preventing me from taking my seat based on his personal assessment of my appearance." Kensington looked uncomfortable. He was a frequent flyer who valued quiet efficiency over public confrontations. "Captain, if her boarding pass is valid." "The boarding pass could be fraudulent." Wellington interrupted. "We have protocols for a reason." Victoria pulled out her phone again. "Lisa, it's me again. Escalate to Protocol 7 Beta." Wellington overheard the call and his irritation spiked. "Ma'am, I don't care who you're calling. You're not boarding this aircraft until security clears this up. Captain Wellington." Victoria said, ending her call and looking directly at him, employee ID 4471, based out of Chicago Hub, 20-year service record, with 3 commendations and 2 passenger complaints. Wellington stared at her, his confidence wavering for the first time. "How do you know my employee ID?" Victoria smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "I know a lot of things, Captain. For instance, I know that federal regulations require you to have reasonable cause to deny boarding to a passenger with a valid ticket. I know that discriminatory language in the presence of witnesses constitutes a violation of company policy, and I know that falsely reporting passenger fraud to airport security is a terminable offense." The crowd had gone silent. Even Jake Anderson's live stream viewers had stopped commenting, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Who are you?" Wellington asked, his voice finally carrying a note of uncertainty. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "That's an interesting question, Captain. And you're about to get a very interesting answer." Security officers were approaching down the jet bridge, but Victoria wasn't watching them. She was watching Wellington's face as he began to realize that he might have made a mistake. Not a small mistake, not a correctable mistake, but the kind of mistake that ended careers. Captain Victoria said softly, "Before security arrives, I want to give you one chance to reconsider your position. Are you absolutely certain that you want to prevent me from taking my seat?" Wellington looked at her face, her calm confidence, the way she spoke with authority rather than pleading. For a moment, doubt crept in, but his pride, his 20 years of unquestioned authority, his inability to admit error in front of passengers and crew locked him into his course. "I'm certain," Wellington said. "You're not boarding my aircraft." Victoria nodded. "Then you've made your choice, Captain. And now you'll live with the consequences." Airport security arrived in the form of Officer Daniel Rodriguez and Officer Amy Chen, both experienced in dealing with passenger disputes but unprepared for what they were about to encounter. Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran, had seen every possible airline drama, drunk passengers, ticket mix-ups, medical emergencies, and the occasional celebrity meltdown. Chen, newer to the job but sharp and observant, immediately noticed the unusual nature of this situation. A captain personally involved in denying boarding a crowd of passengers with phones out and a well-dressed black woman standing calmly in the center of it all. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez asked, approaching Wellington with professional courtesy. Wellington straightened his uniform and assumed the authoritative posture he used when addressing subordinates. "Officers, we have a passenger attempting to board with what appears to be a fraudulent boarding pass. She's been argumentative and refuses to accept that there's been an error." Chen looked at Victoria, noting her calm demeanor and the expensive phone in her hand. In her experience, passengers with fraudulent tickets were usually nervous, aggressive, or already running. This woman appeared to be none of those things. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" Chen asked politely. Victoria handed over her phone without hesitation. Of course, officer. Seat 2A purchased 3 days ago with cash payment. Chen scanned the QR code with her department tablet. The scanner beeped green and information populated on her screen. Valid boarding pass. First class seat. 2A passenger name. Victoria Mills. No security flags, no watch list alerts. No issues in the airline's operational files. The boarding pass is valid, Chen announced to Wellington. No flags in the operation. Wellington's jaw tightened. That's impossible. I'm telling you there's a manifest error. Seat 2A is already occupied. Rodriguez moved past Wellington to peer into the first-class cabin. Seat 2A was clearly empty. Its leather surface unmarked, no personal items, no indication of occupancy. Captain's seat 2A appears to be unoccupied, Rodriguez reported. That's because she hasn't boarded yet. Wellington snapped, his frustration showing. The real passenger for that seat will be arriving shortly. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward. Officers, I witnessed this entire interaction. The captain denied this woman boarding based on her appearance, not any manifest issue. His exact words were, people like you don't just wake up and decide to drop $6,000 on a first-class ticket. Jake Anderson held up his phone. It's all recorded, officers. The whole conversation is being live-streamed. Chen looked at her tablet again, then at Wellington. Captain, I'm showing no other passenger assigned to seat 2A. Could you check your passenger manifest? Wellington hesitated. He'd been so certain of his authority, so confident in his assessment that he hadn't actually verified his claim about the seat being double-booked. He'd simply assumed that his instincts about Victoria were correct. There must be an operational error, Wellington said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Victoria spoke up for the first time since security arrived. Officers, perhaps you should contact Skyline Airways corporate headquarters before proceeding further. Why would we need to do that? Rodriguez asked. Because, Victoria said calmly, I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who I am. Wellington scoffed. She's been claiming to have some kind of special status since she arrived. Probably thinks name-dropping will get her out of trouble. Chen was studying Victoria more carefully now. There was something about her composure, her familiarity with airline procedures, the way she spoke about corporate headquarters as if she had direct access. Ma'am? What kind of misunderstanding? Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Lisa Romano, please. This is Victoria Coleman. The name meant nothing to Wellington or the security officers, but it meant everything to someone listening from the first-class cabin. Robert Kensington's head snapped up. Victoria Coleman. The name had been in every business publication for the past month. The new CEO of Skyline Airways, the turnaround specialist brought in to save a struggling airline, the woman whose appointment had sent the company's stock price soaring. Lisa, it's Victoria. I need you to contact airport security at O'Hare Gate B6. Badge numbers. Victoria looked at the officer's identification, Rodriguez, 4477, and Chen, 8821. They need verification of my identity. Wellington was growing increasingly agitated. This is ridiculous. Security. Are you going to remove her or not? Captain Chen said. Let's wait for the verification call. Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. Unit 447, you have a call from Skyline Airways corporate headquarters. Rodriguez stepped aside to take the call. His expression changed as he listened, his eyebrows rising, his posture shifting from routine enforcement to something approaching reverence. Understood, Rodriguez said into his radio. He turned back to the group, his demeanor completely transformed. Captain Wellington, I need to speak with you privately. Wellington sensed the shift but couldn't understand it. What about, sir? I need to inform you that the passenger you've denied boarding is Victoria Coleman, the chief executive officer of Skyline Airways. The words hit Wellington like a physical blow. The color drained from his face as the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. CEO. Chief Executive Officer. The person who could fire every single employee on the aircraft with a phone call. "That's impossible," Wellington stammered. She doesn't look like... There must be a mistake." Victoria stepped forward. "Captain Wellington, there's no mistake. I've been the CEO of this airline since midnight last night." The board vote was unanimous. The press release goes out tomorrow morning. The jet bridge had gone completely silent except for the soft humming of Jake Anderson's live stream and the whispered conversations of passengers who were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. Kensington emerged from the first-class cabin. Victoria Coleman, the former CFO of Logic Corp. "Hello, Robert," Victoria said with professional warmth. "I didn't expect to see you on this flight." Kensington looked between Victoria and Wellington, his businessman's brain quickly calculating the implications. "James, do you realize what you've done?" Wellington was staring at Victoria as if seeing her for the first time. The woman in the hoodie. The woman he'd dismissed as a fraud, the woman whose authority he'd questioned based on nothing more than his prejudices, was his boss. Not just his supervisor or his manager, but the person who controlled the entire airline. There was no notification. My crew briefing didn't mention. Wellington fumbled for words. "Because I deliberately traveled incognito," Victoria explained. "I wanted to experience our airline as a regular passenger would, to see how our employees treat customers when they don't know they're being observed." Maria Santos let out a quiet laugh. "Ay, Dios mío. Captain, you really stepped in it this time." Chen looked at her tablet again, then at Victoria. "Miss Coleman, what would you like us to do?" Victoria looked at Wellington, who was now pale and sweating despite the air conditioning. "Officers, I appreciate your professionalism. You've done your job correctly. The situation is now an internal matter for Skyline Airways." Rodriguez and Chen exchanged glances. They'd responded to hundreds of passenger disputes, but never one involving a CEO being denied boarding by her own employee. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said carefully, "are you going to file any complaints against Captain Wellington?" Victoria considered the question. Wellington stood frozen, his career hanging in the balance, his 20 years of service reduced to this moment of catastrophic judgment. "That remains to be seen," Victoria said. "Captain Wellington, you've made several serious errors in judgment today. You've violated federal regulations regarding passenger discrimination. You've filed a false report with airport security, and you've created a public spectacle that's being broadcast live to thousands of people." Wellington's eyes widened as he noticed Jake Anderson's phone for the first time, the red recording light, the live viewer count that had climbed to over 2,000 people. However, Victoria continued, "I believe in addressing issues through proper channels. Officers, thank you for your time. Captain Wellington, you and I need to have a conversation. Right now." Sarah Mitchell looked at Maria Santos. "I've never seen anything like this." "Karma," Maria replied simply. 20 years in the making, but karma nonetheless. Jake Anderson spoke directly to his phone's camera. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something extraordinary. A pilot refused to let a black woman board a plane because he didn't think she belonged in first class. She turned out to be the airline's new CEO. The comments are going crazy, and this story is about to go viral." Victoria looked at the crowd of passengers who had witnessed Wellington's behavior. "I want to apologize to everyone who had to see this display. This is not the standard we maintain at Skyline Airways, and it will never happen again." Wellington finally found his voice. "Miss Coleman, I had no idea." "That's exactly the problem," Captain Victoria interrupted. "You had no idea who I was, but you made a decision about who I should be based on your assumptions, and now you're going to learn what happens when those assumptions meet reality. Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed a number that had never been programmed into Wellington's emergency contact list, a number that connected directly to the executive suite of Skyline Airways headquarters in downtown Chicago. Lisa Romano answered on the first ring. Victoria, I've been monitoring the situation. Corporate legal is standing by and I have the board chairman on hold. Wellington watched this phone conversation with growing horror, finally beginning to understand that Victoria's earlier calls hadn't been to friends or relatives, but to the actual power structure of the airline he'd served for 20 years. "Patch me through to Richard Hayes," Victoria said, referring to the board chairman who had personally recruited her from Logic Corp. "Who is Richard Hayes?" Wellington asked weakly. Robert Kensington answered from the cabin doorway. "The chairman of Skyline's board of directors. The man who hired Victoria to save this airline." Victoria's phone switched to speaker mode, and Hayes's voice filled the jet bridge. "Victoria, I understand we have a situation at O'Hare. Richard, I'm standing in the doorway of Flight 847 with Captain James Wellington, employee ID 4471. He's refused to allow me to board the aircraft based on his assessment of my appearance. He's filed a false security report claiming my boarding pass is fraudulent, and he's made several statements that clearly violate federal anti-discrimination laws." Hayes's silence was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice carried 20 years of boardroom authority. "Captain Wellington, this is Richard Hayes, chairman of the board." "Are you listening?" Wellington's voice cracked as he responded. "Yes, sir." "Captain, as of last night's emergency board meeting, Victoria Coleman is the chief executive officer and president of Skyline Airways. She has complete authority over all flight operations, all personnel decisions, and all customer service standards. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Wellington whispered. Victoria Hayes continued. "How would you like to proceed?" Victoria looked at Wellington, who was now visibly shaking. 20 years of aviation experience, a spotless safety record, a reputation for excellence, all of it overshadowed by this moment of catastrophic judgment. "Richard, I want a full investigation of this incident. I want Captain Wellington's employment record reviewed, including any previous passenger complaints, and I want a complete audit of our discrimination training protocols. Understood. Should I connect you with legal?" "Not yet. I'm going to address this situation directly with Captain Wellington first." Victoria ended the call and turned to face Wellington, who looked like a man watching his career disappear in real time. "Captain Victoria," said her voice professional but firm. 20 minutes ago you looked at me and decided I didn't belong in first class. You created a fictional manifest error to justify denying me boarding. You used discriminatory language in front of witnesses. You filed a false security report. And you've created a public incident that's being broadcast live to thousands of people. Wellington tried to speak, but Victoria held up a hand. "I'm not finished. In your 20 years with this airline, how many black women have you denied boarding to first class? I've never..." Wellington stammered. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward. "Actually, Captain, I think that's exactly what happened here. You saw a black woman in casual clothes and immediately assumed she was trying to scam her way into first class. Jake Anderson's live stream was exploding with comments and shares. The viewer count had passed 3,000 and was climbing rapidly as people shared the link across social media platforms. Skyline discrimination was beginning to trend. Maria Santos shook her head sadly. "Captain, in all my years of flying, I've never seen such shameful behavior from an airline employee." Victoria pulled out her phone again, this time calling a different number. "Michael Torres, please report to gate B6 immediately." Wellington looked confused. Michael Torres was the senior flight attendant on this flight, a 15-year veteran whom Wellington had worked with dozens of times. Within minutes, Torres appeared, his uniform crisp, his expression professional but concerned. He'd heard reports of a passenger issue but had no idea of the scope of the situation. "You called for me," Captain Torres asked Wellington. Michael Victoria said, drawing his attention. "I'm Victoria Coleman, the new CEO of Skyline Airways." Torres's eyes widened. He'd heard about the CEO appointment through internal communications, but had never seen a photo of the new leader. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were on this flight. That was intentional, Michael. I wanted to see how our passengers are treated when they don't know I'm watching. What you're witnessing here is Captain Wellington denying me boarding based on his personal assessment of my appearance." Torres looked between Victoria and Wellington, his 15 years of airline experience helping him quickly understand the situation. "Captain, is this true?" Wellington's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Michael, there was a misunderstanding. A manifest error." "What manifest error?" Torres asked, pulling out his tablet. "I have the passenger list right here. Seat 2A is assigned to Victoria Mills, and it's currently unoccupied." Victoria smiled at Torres. "Victoria Mills is my maiden name. I booked the flight under that name to avoid recognition." Torres looked at his tablet again, then at Wellington. "Captain, there's no error in the manifest. Seat 2A is assigned to this passenger." Wellington was cornered by facts, witnesses, technology, and the growing realization that his assumptions had led him into a catastrophic situation. Michael Victoria continued as a senior employee. "What's your assessment of Captain Wellington's handling of this situation?" Torres hesitated clearly, uncomfortable with criticizing a captain in public, but his integrity won out. "Ma'am, with respect to Captain Wellington denying boarding to a passenger with a valid ticket based on their appearance violates every training protocol we have." Victoria nodded. "And what about filing a false security report?" Torres looked directly at Wellington. "That's a terminable offense, ma'am. We're required to report only actual security concerns, not personal suspicions." The crowd of witnesses was growing as more passengers from the delayed flight gathered to see what was causing the holdup. Jake Anderson's stream had attracted viewers from around the world, and the comments section was a mix of outraged support for Victoria and predictions about Wellington's career prospects. Victoria's phone buzzed with another call. She glanced at the screen and saw it was from CNN's transportation correspondent. Word was spreading beyond social media. "Captain Wellington Victoria said you've had multiple opportunities to correct your error to show professional judgment to demonstrate the values that Skyline Airways expects from its employees. Instead, you've doubled down on discrimination, filed false reports, and created a public relations crisis." Wellington finally found his voice. "Ms. Coleman, I had no idea who you were. If I had known—" Victoria's expression hardened. "Captain, that's exactly the problem. Your behavior toward passengers should not depend on their identity, their status, or their ability to affect your career. Every passenger deserves the same respect and dignity regardless of how much money they have or what they're wearing." Kensington spoke up from the cabin doorway. "Victoria's right, James. I've flown with you dozens of times, and you've always been professional with me. But I'm a white man in an expensive suit. Today I watched you treat someone differently based on nothing but their appearance." Torres added, "Captain, I've worked with you for years, and this behavior is completely inconsistent with everything I thought I knew about your character." Wellington looked around at the faces surrounding him. Passengers who had witnessed his discrimination, colleagues who had lost respect for him, security officers who had documented his false statements, and most importantly, the CEO whose authority he had challenged based on nothing but prejudice. "What happens now?" Wellington asked quietly. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "Now, Captain, you learn what accountability looks like." The moment had arrived when all of Wellington's assumptions would collide with reality, when 20 years of unquestioned authority would meet its match in the form of ultimate authority he'd never recognized. Victoria Coleman stood in the doorway of the aircraft she now controlled, looking at the man who had spent 30 minutes trying to prove she didn't belong there. Captain Wellington Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of boardrooms and corporate decisions. Let me be very clear about something. 3 days ago, I left my position as CFO of Logic Corp, where I was responsible for $12 billion in annual revenue. 2 days ago, the Skyline Airways Board of Directors voted unanimously to name me CEO and president of this airline. Yesterday, I attended meetings about fleet modernization, route optimization, and employee satisfaction scores. Today, I booked a first-class ticket on my own airline to see how our passengers are treated when nobody knows I'm watching. Wellington's face had gone from pale to ashen. The woman he'd dismissed, the passenger he'd humiliated, the person he'd accused of fraud, was the most powerful person in the Skyline Airways organization. But that's impossible. Wellington whispered, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in the hoodie with the corporate executive she was revealing herself to be. You don't look like what Captain Victoria's question cut through his confusion like a blade. Like a CEO, like someone who belongs in first class, like someone who could afford a $6,000 ticket. Jake Anderson's live stream had become appointment television for thousands of viewers worldwide. The comments were flooding in faster than anyone could read them, but the sentiment was universal. Wellington had spectacularly misjudged the situation. This is incredible, Jake narrated to his audience. The pilot who refused to let this black woman board is about to learn she's the CEO of the airline. The irony is off the charts. Sarah Mitchell was recording with her own phone, understanding that she was witnessing a moment that would be studied in business schools and diversity training programs for years to come. Maria Santos shook her head in amazement. 40 years of flying, and I've never seen anything like this. That poor captain has no idea what he's done to himself. Michael Torres, the flight attendant, looked at Wellington with something approaching pity. 15 years of working together, and Torres had never imagined his captain capable of such catastrophic judgment. Victoria's phone rang again. The caller ID showed CNN breaking news. She declined the call, but its appearance demonstrated how quickly the story was spreading beyond social media into mainstream news coverage. Captain Victoria continued, when I was named CEO, I made a commitment to understand every aspect of this airline's operation. I wanted to experience what our passengers experience, to see how our employees treat customers when they think no one important is watching. You've given me exactly the education I was looking for. Wellington tried one more desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Ms. Coleman, if you had just identified yourself from the beginning. No. Victoria's voice cut him off with finality. The fact that you didn't know who I was is irrelevant. Every passenger on this airline, regardless of their race, their clothing, their apparent wealth, or their position, deserves the same dignity and respect. The moment you decided I didn't belong in first class based on my appearance, you violated the fundamental principles of customer service and human decency. Robert Kensington stepped forward from the first-class cabin. James, I've known Victoria by reputation for years. She's one of the most respected executives in corporate America. The fact that she's also the person you just discriminated against is, well, it's career-ending. Torres pulled out his tablet and began typing. Ms. Coleman, I'm filing an incident report about this situation. As senior flight attendant, I have a responsibility to document violations of company policy. Michael Victoria said I appreciate your professionalism. Make sure that report includes every detail of Captain Wellington's behavior. Wellington watched Torres typing and realized that the documentation of his discrimination was being entered into the airline's permanent records by his own crew member. Everything was being recorded, reported, documented, preserved for the investigation that was surely coming. There will be an investigation, Wellington said, grasping for some hope. Union representatives due process. Victoria nodded. Absolutely, Captain. You'll have full due process. Your union representative will be present for all interviews. Every policy will be followed precisely. And when that investigation is complete, when every procedure has been observed, when every regulation has been satisfied, you'll be terminated for cause." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Terminated for cause meant no severance package, no positive references, no quiet transition to another airline. It meant the end of a flying career. Ms. Coleman Wellington pleaded, "I have 20 years with this company. My record is spotless. I've never had a passenger complaint." "You have 2 passenger complaints," Victoria corrected, pulling out her phone and accessing files that Wellington didn't even know existed. September 2019. A Hispanic family filed a complaint about your treatment during boarding. You questioned their right to be in premium economy based on their appearance. March 2021. An elderly black man complained that you were dismissive and rude when he asked for assistance with his carry-on bag. Both complaints were filed with customer service and apparently ignored by management. Wellington's mouth fell open. He'd forgotten about those incidents, dismissed them as minor misunderstandings, never imagining they would become part of his permanent record. Torres looked up from his tablet. "Captain, I remember the 2021 incident. I tried to talk to you about it afterward. Those were misunderstandings." Wellington protested weakly. "3 misunderstandings involving passengers of color," Victoria pointed out. "That's not a coincidence, Captain. That's a pattern. Jake Anderson's live stream audience was approaching 5,000 viewers and #Skyline discrimination was trending nationally. Major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story from social media. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake announced to his viewers, what you're seeing here is 20 years of prejudice meeting its consequences. This captain built his career on assumptions about who belongs where, and today those assumptions have destroyed everything he worked for." Victoria looked around at the crowd of witnesses, passengers who had seen discrimination in real time, employees who had watched their colleagues' career implode, security officers who had documented false statements, and social media users who were broadcasting the entire incident to the world. Captain Wellington Victoria said with finality, "Your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft. Your personal belongings will be forwarded to you, and your final paycheck will reflect termination for cause." Wellington stood in the doorway of the aircraft he would never command again, looking at the woman whose authority he had questioned, whose dignity he had assaulted, whose rights he had violated. 20 years of flying gone in 30 minutes of catastrophic judgment. "This can't be happening," Wellington said, his voice barely audible. Victoria looked at him with something that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with steel resolve. "Captain, this is exactly what happens when prejudice meets consequences. You chose to judge me by my appearance rather than my character. Now you'll be judged by your actions rather than your experience." Victoria Coleman stepped fully into the aircraft doorway, and in that moment, the entire power dynamic of Flight 847 shifted like tectonic plates, rearranging the landscape. She was no longer a passenger seeking boarding. She was the CEO taking control of her airline, her aircraft, and her company's reputation. Lisa Romano. Victoria set into her phone, speaking to her executive assistant, who had been monitoring the situation from corporate headquarters. "Initialize emergency protocol Alpha. I'm assuming operational control of Flight 847. 20 miles away in downtown Chicago." Lisa Romano's fingers flew across her keyboard, accessing operational protocols that few people in the airline industry even knew existed. Emergency Protocol Alpha was designed for situations where executive intervention was required to prevent company-wide damage. It had never been used before. Victoria Fuarn have the emergency response team online. Legal, PR, HR, and the board chairman are all standing by. "What are your immediate instructions?" Victoria looked at Wellington, who was still standing in the doorway, his career crumbling around him like a building under demolition. "Terminate Captain James Wellington immediately." Log the termination as for cause due to passenger discrimination and false reporting. Coordinate with airport security to have him escorted from the aircraft and the terminal. Officers Rodriguez and Chen, who had remained on the jet bridge to observe the resolution of the incident, exchanged glances. In their combined 15 years of handling airline disputes, they had never witnessed an employee being fired in real time during the incident itself. Wellington made one final attempt to salvage his situation. "Ms. Coleman, please, I can explain." Captain Victoria interrupted. "There's nothing to explain. Your behavior today has been documented by multiple witnesses, recorded on live stream and observed by airport security. You violated federal anti-discrimination laws, filed false reports, and demonstrated exactly the kind of culture that's been destroying this airline's reputation." Michael Torres. The senior flight attendant stepped forward with his tablet. "Ms. Coleman, I've completed the incident report. It includes timestamps, witness statements, and Captain Wellington's exact words regarding people like you." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Michael, given your professionalism during this incident, I'm promoting you to Acting Chief of In-Flight Standards effective immediately. Your first responsibility will be ensuring this flight departs with proper leadership." Torres' eyes widened. "Ma'am, I don't have pilot credentials." "You don't need pilot credentials to ensure proper customer service. First Officer Kim will handle the flying. You'll handle making sure every passenger on this aircraft receives the dignity they deserve." From the cockpit door, First Officer David Kim appeared, his face pale with the realization of what had just transpired. "Ms. Coleman, I witnessed some of Captain Wellington's behavior from the cockpit. I should have intervened." Victoria studied Kim for a moment. "Officer Kim, what exactly did you witness?" "I heard Captain Wellington speaking to you in a tone I've never heard him use with other first-class passengers. I heard him claim there was a manifest error when I knew the manifest was correct. And I heard him use language that—" Kim paused, choosing his words carefully, that seemed based on assumptions about your appearance, rather than facts about your ticket. "And why didn't you intervene?" Kim looked ashamed. "Captain Wellington has been flying for 20 years. I've only been with Skyline for 3 years. I was afraid to challenge his authority." Victoria considered this response. "Officer Kim, what's more important, hierarchy or human dignity?" "Human dignity, ma'am." "Then you've learned something valuable today. I'm promoting you to acting captain of this flight. Don't make me regret that decision by staying silent when you witness discrimination in the future." The crowd of passengers who had witnessed the entire incident broke into spontaneous applause. Jake Anderson's live stream viewers were flooding the comments with support for Victoria's leadership and amazement at the swift justice they were witnessing. Sarah Mitchell approached Victoria, "Miss Coleman, as someone who travels frequently for business, I want you to know that what I witnessed today was exactly the kind of leadership the airline industry needs." Maria Santos added, "In 40 years of flying, I've seen too many passengers treated poorly based on their appearance. What you did today gives me hope that things can change." Wellington stood frozen in the doorway, watching his replacement being promoted. His authority transferred his career, ending in the most public way possible. "This is union business," he said desperately. "You can't just fire me without due process." Victoria pulled out her phone and dialed another number. "Thomas Henderson, please. This is Victoria Coleman." "Thomas, I need you to speak with Captain Wellington about union procedures for termination due to discrimination and false reporting." "Yes, he's here now." She handed the phone to Wellington. "Captain, speak with your union representative." Wellington took the phone with shaking hands. The conversation was brief, one-sided, and devastating. When he handed the phone back to Victoria, his face was the color of old concrete. "What did he tell you?" Victoria asked. "The union won't fight a termination for discrimination," Wellington said quietly. "Not when it's documented like this." Lisa Romano's voice came through Victoria's phone speaker. Victoria, I have CNN Fox Business and the Wall Street Journal requesting statements about the incident. Social media traffic is through the roof, and our stock price is actually climbing based on positive response to your handling of the situation. Victoria looked at the assembled crowd passengers who had witnessed transformation in real time, employees who had seen accountability in action, and security officers who had documented justice being served. Lisa, schedule a press conference for this afternoon. I want to address this incident, directly explain our zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and announce new measures to ensure this never happens again. Rodriguez stepped forward. Ms. Coleman, what would you like us to do with Captain Wellington? Victoria looked at Wellington one final time. 20 years of service reduced to this moment of catastrophic judgment. Officers, please escort Mr. Wellington from the terminal. He's no longer an employee of Skyline Airways. As security moved to accompany Wellington away from the aircraft, he turned back to Victoria. You've destroyed my career over a misunderstanding. Victoria's response was quiet but firm. Captain, I didn't destroy your career. Your prejudices did. Your assumptions did. Your inability to see a black woman as a person deserving of dignity did. I just provided the consequences. Wellington was led away down the jet bridge past the gate area where Carmen Valdez was about to learn that her discriminatory behavior had also been documented and would also result in termination. Acting Captain Kim returned to the cockpit to prepare for departure. Michael Torres began addressing the passengers who had witnessed the incident, apologizing for the delay and ensuring everyone was comfortable. Victoria stood in the aircraft doorway for a moment longer, looking out at the terminal that had been the scene of her humiliation and was now the site of her vindication. Jake Anderson concluded his live stream with a summary for his audience. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something extraordinary. An airline captain refused to let a black woman board because he assumed she didn't belong in first class. She turned out to be the new CEO of the airline. Justice was swift, consequences were severe, and change was immediate. This is how accountability should work. Victoria finally took her seat in 2A, the seat she had rightfully purchased, the seat she had been denied, based on prejudice, the seat from which she would now lead an airline toward a more equitable future. As Victoria settled into seat 2A, the aircraft cabin had transformed from a routine commercial flight into a classroom for corporate leadership, human dignity, and the swift application of justice. The other first-class passengers who had witnessed the entire incident regarded her with a mixture of respect and amazement. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria announced, standing to address the cabin. My name is Victoria Coleman, and as of yesterday, I am the CEO of Skyline Airways. I owe each of you an apology for what you witnessed today. The cabin fell silent except for the soft hum of the aircraft's ventilation systems. Every passenger from first class to the back of economy was listening to their CEO address them directly. No passenger should ever be subjected to discrimination based on their race, their appearance, or their perceived social status. What Captain Wellington did to me today was unacceptable, and it would have been equally unacceptable if he had done it to any of you. Robert Kensington, the oil executive in seat 1A, raised his hand slightly. Victoria, in all my years of flying, I've never seen an airline CEO handle a crisis so directly and decisively. Robert, this wasn't a crisis. This was an opportunity to demonstrate that discrimination has consequences, that accountability is immediate, and that corporate values are more than words in an employee handbook. Sarah Mitchell, who had moved to an aisle seat to better observe, spoke up. Ms. Coleman, what assurance do we have that this was an isolated incident and not representative of broader cultural problems at Skyline Victoria? Appreciated the direct question. Sarah, that's exactly why I was flying incognito today. I wanted to experience our airline as a regular passenger would. Unfortunately, what I experienced confirms that we have significant cultural issues that require immediate attention. She pulled out her phone and called Lisa Romano again. Lisa, connect me to Carmen Valdez at Gate K12. The call was answered immediately. Carmen Valdez speaking. Carmen, this is Victoria Coleman, CEO of Skyline Airways. I believe you remember our interaction at the gate this morning. The silence on the other end was deafening. Finally, Carmen's voice came through noticeably shaken. Ms. Coleman, I had no idea. Carmen, you accused me of fraud, questioned my payment method, and announced to the gate area that security had been notified about booking irregularities. How do you explain that behavior? I was following security protocols, Carmen said weakly. Victoria's response was heard by everyone on the aircraft. Carmen, I've reviewed the security protocols. There's nothing in any manual that requires gate agents to interrogate first-class passengers about their payment methods or make public announcements about alleged irregularities. Your behavior was based on your assumptions about who belongs in first class. Michael Torres, now serving in his new role as acting chief of in-flight standards, was documenting the conversation for inclusion in the growing file of discriminatory behavior. Carmen Victoria continued, Your employment with Skyline Airways is terminated effective immediately. Report to your supervisor for final processing. The call ended and Victoria looked around the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, accountability doesn't stop with one employee. Everyone who participated in today's discrimination will face consequences. Jake Anderson, who had ended his live stream but was still recording for his social media channels, raised his hand. Coleman, what changes are you implementing to prevent this from happening to other passengers? Victoria smiled at the question. Jake, thank you for documenting today's incident. Your live stream has already reached hundreds of thousands of people, and it's going to serve as training material for our employees. She stood and addressed the entire cabin again. Effective immediately, Skyline Airways is implementing the Dignity for All initiative. Every employee will undergo intensive bias training. Every passenger interaction will be monitored and evaluated, and every incident of discrimination will result in immediate termination. An elderly woman in economy class called out, What about passengers who've already experienced discrimination but didn't have cameras recording it? Victoria walked toward the back of the aircraft, moving through business class and into economy. Ma'am, what's your name? Dorothy Washington. I've been flying for 50 years and I've experienced my share of airline discrimination. Ms. Washington, we're establishing a Passenger Dignity Review Board. Any passenger who has experienced discrimination on Skyline Airways can file a complaint that will be investigated by an independent panel. If discrimination is confirmed, we'll provide full compensation, formal apologies, and travel credits. The aircraft erupted in applause. Passengers throughout the cabin were witnessing corporate accountability in real time, seeing a CEO who didn't hide behind public relations teams and carefully crafted statements. A young Hispanic man in business class stood up. Ms. Coleman, I'm a frequent flyer on Skyline. Will these changes affect loyal customers who haven't experienced discrimination? Sir, these changes will improve service for everyone. When employees treat all passengers with dignity, when bias is eliminated from customer interactions, when respect becomes the standard rather than the exception, every passenger benefits. Acting Captain Kim's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure. Victoria returned to her seat, but before sitting down, she addressed the cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, today began with discrimination and humiliation. It's ending with justice and transformation. You've witnessed something that's never happened before in commercial aviation, a real-time response to bias that resulted in immediate consequences and immediate change. Maria Santos called out from her seat. Ms. Coleman, You've given me hope that my grandchildren will fly in a world where they're judged by their character, not their appearance." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Victoria reflected on the past hour. She had boarded as a passenger experiencing discrimination and was now seated as a CEO who had fundamentally changed her company's culture in real time. Michael Torres approached her seat. "Ms. Coleman, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for standing up not just for yourself, but for every passenger who's ever been treated unfairly. Michael, you stood up when it mattered. That's why you're now in a leadership position. Surround yourself with people who have the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult." Robert Kensington leaned over from seat 1A. "Victoria, I've been in corporate leadership for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a crisis with such grace and decisiveness. Robert, this wasn't about handling a crisis. This was about revealing character. Wellington's character, Carmen's character, and ultimately the character of Skyline Airways as a company." As Flight 847 climbed into the sky above Chicago, its passengers weren't just traveling to London, they were carrying with them the story of the day that airline discrimination met its match, the day that consequences were immediate, and the day that change began with a single word: dignity. While Flight 847 climbed toward its cruising altitude, the corporate headquarters of Skyline Airways in downtown Chicago had transformed into a crisis response center unlike anything in the company's 60-year history. But this wasn't a crisis in the traditional sense. It was the controlled detonation of dysfunctional culture and the rapid construction of something better. Lisa Romano, Victoria's executive assistant and closest corporate ally, had converted the executive conference room into a mission control center. 6 large monitors displayed real-time social media feeds, news coverage, stock prices, and internal company communications. The energy in the room was electric, not with panic, but with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lisa announced to the assembled team of department heads, "we're witnessing the most positive public relations moment in Skyline's recent history. Our CEO just fired a discriminatory captain and gate agent in real time, implemented new policies on the spot, and demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership our passengers have been demanding." Richard Hayes, the board chairman, was participating via video conference from New York, where he was cutting short a meeting with investment bankers to focus entirely on the situation. "Lisa, what's our media response strategy?" Chairman Hayes Victoria wants to hold a live press conference this afternoon. No prepared statements, no corporate speak, just direct answers about what happened and what we're doing to fix our culture. The head of public relations, Jennifer Castro, looked nervous. "Lisa, that's incredibly risky. Unscripted press conferences can go wrong in so many ways." Lisa smiled. "Jennifer, have you been watching the social media response? We have hundreds of thousands of people praising Victoria's handling of the situation. #Skyline. Accountability is trending worldwide. Our stock price is up 8% since this morning." On one of the monitors, CNN was running breaking news coverage of the incident. The chyron read, "Airline CEO fires discriminatory pilot in real time." The network was showing clips from Jake Anderson's live stream, focusing on the moment when Wellington's authority crumbled and Victoria's leadership emerged. Thomas Kumar, the head of human resources, raised his hand. "Lisa, what about the union implications? Wellington's termination will require extensive documentation." "Thomas, we have everything we need. Multiple witnesses, video documentation, security reports, and a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior." Wellington's own union representative confirmed they won't fight a termination for discrimination. The legal department head, Patricia Nguyen, was reviewing files on her laptop. "I've been analyzing our liability exposure. Ironically, Victoria's immediate response to the discrimination actually protects us legally. By addressing the behavior immediately and implementing corrective measures in real time, we've demonstrated good faith efforts to remedy the situation." Chairman Hayes leaned forward on the video screen. "What about Carmen Valdez? Also terminated." Lisa confirmed. Victoria handled both situations with the same decisive leadership. No appeals, no negotiations, no second chances for discrimination. Jennifer Castro was monitoring news coverage on multiple devices. CNN is requesting an exclusive interview. Fox Business wants a statement about our new policies. The Wall Street Journal is asking about the financial impact. Lisa looked at the assembled team. Here's how we're handling media requests. Victoria will hold one press conference this afternoon. All networks can attend, all questions are fair game, and Victoria will speak for herself without handlers or pre-approved talking points. The head of operations, David Martinez, spoke up. What about the immediate operational impact? We have hundreds of flights today with crews who are probably hearing about this incident. David. That's exactly what Victoria wants, Lisa replied. She wants every Skyline employee to understand that discrimination has immediate consequences. We're using this incident as a teachable moment for the entire organization. On the largest monitor, social media analytics showed the story's viral spread. Jake Anderson's original live stream had been shared over 50,000 times. #Skyline discrimination was trending in 15 countries. Customer comments were overwhelmingly positive, praising Victoria's leadership and promising to choose Skyline for future travel. Chairman Hayes addressed the room through the video conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear about something. When we hired Victoria Coleman as CEO, we knew she was a transformational leader. Today, she's demonstrated exactly why we made that choice. This isn't a crisis. This is a breakthrough. Lisa nodded in agreement. Chairman Hayes, Victoria's response today has accomplished more for our corporate culture than 5 years of diversity training programs. The financial markets were responding positively as well. Skyline's stock price, which had been struggling for months due to customer service complaints and reputation issues, was experiencing its best day in over a year. Jennifer Castro looked up from her phone. I'm getting reports that other airlines are already issuing statements about their own discrimination policies. Victoria's actions today aren't just changing Skyline, they're changing the entire industry. Patricia Nguyen, still reviewing legal implications, added, we should expect copycat situations. Other passengers who've experienced discrimination may come forward expecting the same level of response they saw today. Lisa smiled. Patricia. That's exactly what Victoria wants. She's establishing a new standard for how airlines respond to discrimination. If other passengers come forward, we'll investigate every case with the same thoroughness. Thomas Kumar raised another concern. What about employee morale? Some staff might be concerned about job security if standards are being enforced this strictly. Thomas Lisa replied, employees who treat passengers with dignity have nothing to worry about. Employees who discriminate should be concerned because Victoria just demonstrated that bias has immediate consequences. The head of training and development, Sandra Lopez, was taking notes throughout the meeting. I'm already developing new training materials based on today's incident. This will become a case study in how to respond to discrimination with swift, decisive action. David Martinez looked at the operational data on his screen. Flight 847 is performing normally. Acting Captain Kim has reported no issues with the flight operations, and passenger feedback from the flight is extremely positive. Chairman Hayes addressed the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened today isn't just about firing 2 employees who discriminated against passengers. It's about establishing a new culture where dignity is non-negotiable, where accountability is immediate, and where leadership means taking action rather than making excuses. Lisa looked around the room at the department heads who would be responsible for implementing Victoria's vision. Everyone understand their responsibilities. HR will review all discrimination complaints from the past 5 years. Training will develop new bias prevention programs. Legal will ensure our policies exceed federal requirements. Operations will monitor employee behavior more closely. And public relations will tell our story honestly and transparently. The room buzzed with energy as each department began planning their response to Victoria's transformation of the company culture. "One more thing," Lisa announced. "Victoria wants to establish a passenger dignity fund. Any passenger who has experienced discrimination on Skyline Airways will receive full compensation, formal apologies, and travel credits. We're not just fixing the future, we're addressing past wrongs." Jennifer Castro looked up from her media monitoring. "Lisa, this story is going international. BBC Deutsche Welle and Al Jazeera are all covering the incident as a breakthrough moment for airline accountability." "Good," Lisa replied. "Victoria wants the world to see that discrimination has consequences, that corporate leaders can demonstrate moral courage, and that change is possible when people in power choose to use that power responsibly." As the meeting concluded and department heads dispersed to implement Victoria's initiatives, the Corporate Response Center continued monitoring the situation. Flight 847 was halfway across the Atlantic, carrying passengers who had witnessed transformation in real time. The live stream footage was being viewed by millions of people worldwide. And in a few hours, Victoria Coleman would face the media to explain not just what had happened, but what it meant for the future of airline travel. The age of accountability had arrived at 30,000 feet, and there would be no turning back. Within 6 hours of Flight 847's departure from Chicago, Skyline Airways had implemented the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in commercial aviation history. Victoria Coleman's swift response to Captain Wellington's behavior had created momentum that was reshaping the airline industry in real time. In the corporate headquarters, Lisa Romano was coordinating with department heads to translate Victoria's vision into concrete policies. The emergency session had evolved into a transformation workshop with each department contributing to what would become known as the Wellington Protocol, a comprehensive approach to preventing and addressing discrimination named after the captain whose behavior had catalyzed change. Thomas Lisa said to the HR director, "Victoria wants every employee to undergo bias training within 30 days. Not optional, not suggested, mandatory." Thomas Kumar was already drafting implementation plans. "Lisa, we have 12,000 employees across 40 cities. This is going to require significant resources. Victoria's authorized unlimited budget for this initiative. Hire external trainers. Bring in civil rights experts. Partner with universities. Whatever it takes." She wants Skyline to become the gold standard for airline equality. Sandra Lopez, the training director, was reviewing curricula from diversity specialists nationwide. "I'm contacting Dr. Amara Johnson from Harvard Business School. She's the leading expert on implicit bias in service industries. If we can get her to design our training program—" "Get her," Lisa interrupted. "Victoria wants the best minds working on this problem." The legal department was drafting new policies that would exceed federal requirements for discrimination prevention. Patricia Nguyen had assembled a team of employment lawyers and civil rights attorneys to ensure Skyline's standards would be legally bulletproof. "We're implementing zero tolerance," Patricia explained to the assembled team. "One documented incident of discrimination results in immediate termination. No warnings, no second chances, no appeals based on seniority or past performance." David Martinez, the operations director, was developing real-time monitoring processes. "We're installing new technology that will track employee interactions with passengers. Voice analysis software will flag potentially discriminatory language, and supervisors will review flagged interactions within 24 hours. The technology was cutting-edge, developed by artificial intelligence specialists who had previously worked on bias detection for social media platforms. The operational protocol could identify subtle linguistic patterns that indicated discriminatory attitudes even when the language wasn't explicitly offensive. "This isn't about spying on employees," David clarified. "It's about identifying training opportunities and preventing discrimination before it escalates to incidents like we saw today." Jennifer Castro, monitoring media response, looked up from her screens. Victoria's press conference is generating massive positive coverage. The hashtag Dignity at Altitude is trending globally, and customer bookings are up 40% since this morning. The financial impact was unprecedented. Skyline's stock price had climbed 15% in one day, the largest single-day gain in the company's history. Investment analysts were praising Victoria's leadership and projecting significant revenue growth based on improved customer confidence. Passengers want to fly with an airline that stands for something Chairman Hayes observed from his video conference connection. Victoria has given them exactly that. Michael Torres, who had been promoted to acting chief of in-flight standards during the incident, was now working with the training department to develop new customer service protocols. His 15 years of flight attendant experience provided practical insights into how discrimination typically manifested in day-to-day operations. Most bias isn't as obvious as what Captain Wellington did. Torres explained to the training team, it's subtle, different tones of voice, different levels of assistance, different assumptions about passenger needs. We need to train employees to recognize these patterns in themselves. The new protocols included specific behavioral standards. All passengers would be greeted with the same courtesy phrases. Assistance would be offered equally regardless of appearance, and any deviation from standard procedures would require documentation and justification. Sandra Lopez was developing role-playing scenarios based on real discrimination incidents from across the industry. We're creating training modules where employees experience bias from the passenger perspective. When you've felt what discrimination feels like, you're much less likely to perpetrate it yourself. The training would be immersive and emotionally engaging, designed to create empathy rather than simply impart information. Employees would participate in simulations where they experienced profiling discrimination and exclusion, then debrief about how those experiences affected them. Lisa Romano received a call from Victoria, who was now over the Atlantic, but staying connected to headquarters via satellite communication. Victoria, how do you want to handle the media requests about specific employees? No names. Victoria replied immediately. Wellington and Valdez have been terminated, but I won't participate in personal destruction. The focus should be on policies, not people. Understood. What about the Passenger Dignity Review Board you announced on the aircraft? Get it operational within 48 hours. Independent panel victims advocates, civil rights attorneys. Any passenger who files a discrimination complaint gets a response within 72 hours and a resolution within 2 weeks. The review board would have unprecedented authority within the airline industry, with power to order compensation policy changes and employee discipline based on their findings. It would be chaired by retired federal judge Margaret Williams, who had been a passenger on Flight 847 and had witnessed Victoria's response firsthand. Judge Williams agreed to chair the board, Lisa reported. She said Victoria's handling of the situation convinced her that Skyline is serious about change. Thomas Kumar was coordinating with union representatives to ensure the new policies were implemented fairly. Despite initial concerns about job security, most unions were supporting the initiatives after seeing the positive public response. Union leadership understands that discrimination liability affects everyone, Kumar explained. When passengers lose confidence in an airline, everyone's job becomes less secure. The operations team was implementing new hiring standards that emphasized cultural competency alongside technical qualifications. Future Skyline employees would be evaluated not just on their ability to perform job functions, but on their commitment to treating all passengers with dignity. We're partnering with historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, and Native American tribal colleges to diversify our recruitment, Martinez announced. Victoria wants our workforce to reflect the diversity of our passengers. As the day concluded, the transformation of Skyline Airways was accelerating beyond what anyone had imagined possible 12 hours earlier. What had begun as one woman's experience of discrimination had become an industry-wide moment of reckoning that would influence airline policies for decades to come. The Wellington Protocol was complete a comprehensive approach to discrimination prevention that other airlines were already inquiring about adopting. Victoria Coleman had turned her personal experience of bias into a blueprint for corporate accountability that was being studied by business schools, civil rights organizations, and government agencies worldwide. 6 months after the Wellington incident, Skyline Airways had become the most studied airline in corporate America. Business schools used Victoria Coleman's transformation strategy as a case study in crisis leadership. Civil rights organizations pointed to Skyline as proof that corporate change was possible when leaders demonstrated moral courage. And most importantly, passengers were choosing Skyline in record numbers because they trusted the airline to treat them with dignity. Victoria stood in the executive boardroom looking out at the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, preparing for the quarterly board meeting that would evaluate the success of the cultural transformation. The statistics spoke for themselves. Customer satisfaction, up 85%, employee retention, up 60%, discrimination, complaints down 95%. And revenue growth exceeding projections by 200%. The transformation has exceeded every metric we established, Chairman Hayes announced to the assembled board members. Victoria, your response to the Wellington incident didn't just solve a public relations crisis, it created a sustainable competitive advantage. Board member Dr. Angela Foster, an organizational psychology professor from Northwestern University, had been monitoring the cultural changes from an academic perspective. Victoria, what you've accomplished here challenges every assumption about how long organizational change takes. Most experts say cultural transformation requires 3 to 5 years. You've done it in 6 months. Victoria took her seat at the head of the conference table. Dr. Foster, I think the timeline reflects the urgency of the problem. When discrimination is immediate and harmful, the response needs to be immediate and healing. Lisa Romano presented the implementation data. We've trained 12,000 employees in bias recognition and prevention. We've processed 847 passenger dignity complaints through the review board. We've compensated 312 passengers who experienced past discrimination. And we've hired 2,300 new employees, specifically recruited for cultural competency. The financial impact was staggering. Skyline's stock price had doubled since the Wellington incident, making it the best-performing airline stock of the year. Revenue per passenger had increased 35% as customers chose Skyline over competitors specifically because of the airline's reputation for equality. Michael Torres, who had been permanently promoted to Vice President of Passenger Experience, joined the board meeting to report on frontline implementation. Board members, the culture change is visible in daily operations. Employees understand that treating passengers with dignity isn't just policy, it's the core of their job security. Torres had become the face of Skyline's transformation, appearing in training videos, speaking at industry conferences, and representing the airline at civil rights events. His promotion from flight attendant to vice president demonstrated Victoria's commitment to elevating employees who displayed moral courage. Michael board member Robert Chen asked how are employees responding to the new standards. Mr. Chen, initially there was some resistance from employees who felt the standards were too strict. But when they saw the positive passenger response, when they experienced the job security that comes with customer loyalty, when they realized that dignity creates better working conditions for everyone, resistance turned into enthusiasm. Dr. Foster was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of the transformation. Victoria, how did you address employees who might have harbored implicit biases without creating defensiveness or resistance? Dr. Foster, we focused on behavior rather than beliefs. We didn't try to change hearts and minds directly, we changed actions and policies. When people consistently behave with dignity, dignified thinking follows. The training program had become a model for other industries. Companies across America were sending executives to observe Skyline's bias prevention workshops. Harvard Business School had developed an entire semester course around Victoria's leadership during the Wellington incident. Sandra Lopez, the training director, provided updates on the educational initiatives. We've established partnerships with 12 universities to research bias in customer service. We've published 4 academic papers on discrimination prevention, and we've licensed our training materials to 63 other companies. Skyline wasn't just changing its own culture, it was influencing culture change across corporate America. The Wellington Protocol was being implemented in hospitals, banks, retail companies, and government agencies. Victoria's approach was proving that moral leadership could be both principled and profitable. The Passenger Dignity Review Board has processed over 800 cases, reported Judge Margaret Williams, who continued to chair the board despite numerous other opportunities. We've found discrimination in 47% of cases reviewed, resulting in over $2.3 million in compensation to affected passengers. More importantly, the review board was identifying patterns that helped prevent future discrimination. Analysis of complaint data revealed that bias incidents were most likely to occur during peak travel times at certain airport locations and involving specific demographic combinations that triggered implicit stereotypes. We're using predictive analytics to prevent discrimination before it occurs, explained David Martinez, the operations director. When our data indicates high-risk conditions for bias incidents, we deploy additional supervision and support resources. The technology implementation had exceeded expectations. Voice analysis software was identifying potentially problematic interactions with 94% accuracy, allowing supervisors to intervene before situations escalated. Employees appreciated the support rather than feeling surveilled. Employees tell us the monitoring makes them feel more confident in customer interactions. Martinez continued. They know that if a situation becomes difficult, supervisors will review the interaction objectively, rather than simply accepting passenger complaints. Victoria looked around the boardroom at the people who had helped transform not just an airline, but an approach to corporate responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, we had a choice. We could have treated the Wellington incident as an isolated problem requiring minimal response, or we could have used it as a catalyst for fundamental change. We chose transformation. Chairman Hayes nodded approvingly. Victoria, the board unanimously supports your approach. More importantly, the market supports your approach. Passengers, investors, and employees are all benefiting from your leadership. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by government officials. The Department of Transportation was considering new federal requirements based on Skyline's voluntary standards. Congressional representatives were citing Skyline as proof that corporate self-regulation could be more effective than government mandates. We've received inquiries from airlines in 17 countries about adopting the Wellington Protocol, Jennifer Castro reported from the Public Relations Department. Victoria's leadership is influencing aviation policy internationally. As the board meeting concluded, Victoria reflected on how one moment of discrimination had become a movement for dignity. Captain Wellington's prejudice had revealed problems that required solutions. Carmen Valdez's bias had exposed training needs that required addressing. And Victoria's response had demonstrated that moral courage could transform not just individuals but entire organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, Victoria concluded the Wellington incident taught us that discrimination isn't just wrong, it's expensive. Dignity isn't just right, it's profitable. When we create cultures where everyone belongs, everyone benefits. The cultural transformation of Skyline Airways was complete, but its influence was just beginning. Victoria Coleman had proven that one leader's commitment to equality could change not just a company, but an entire industry's approach to human dignity. 1 year after the Wellington incident, the commercial aviation industry bore little resemblance to the discrimination-tolerant culture that had enabled Captain Wellington's behavior. Victoria Coleman's response to bias had triggered a cascade of policy changes, regulatory reforms, and cultural shifts that extended far beyond Skyline Airways to influence how airlines worldwide approached passenger dignity. The Federal Aviation Administration had implemented new requirements based directly on Skyline's voluntary standards. The Coleman standards, as they became known in regulatory circles, required all U.S. airlines to establish passenger dignity. Review boards implement bias training for customer-facing employees and maintain real-time monitoring operational protocols for discrimination prevention. Victoria Coleman's leadership during the Wellington incident demonstrated that swift accountability could prevent widespread liability, explained FAA Administrator Sarah Morrison during congressional testimony. Rather than waiting for discrimination to accumulate and create legal exposure, airlines now have tools to address bias immediately and effectively. International aviation authorities were adopting similar standards. The European Aviation Safety Agency, Transport Canada, and the Civil Aviation Authority of the United Kingdom had all implemented versions of the Coleman standards after analyzing the positive outcomes at Skyline Airways. Dr. Amara Johnson from Harvard Business School, who had designed Skyline's bias training program, was now consulting with airlines worldwide. The Wellington incident proved that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's financially devastating. Airlines that maintain discriminatory cultures face immediate market punishment, while airlines that demonstrate commitment to dignity experience immediate market rewards. The economic impact was measurable across the industry. Airlines that had implemented Coleman standards were outperforming competitors in customer satisfaction, employee retention, and revenue growth. Passengers were making booking decisions based partially on airlines' discrimination policies, creating market incentives for equality. United Airlines had experienced its own Wellington-style incident 6 months after the Skyline transformation when a gate agent in Denver made discriminatory comments to a Hispanic family. However, United's immediate response, terminating the employee within hours, compensating the family, and implementing additional training, demonstrated how Victoria's approach had established new industry standards for accountability. The Victoria Coleman playbook has become the gold standard for addressing discrimination, explained aviation industry analyst Rebecca Torres during a CNBC interview. Airlines that fail to respond decisively to bias incidents face immediate stock price consequences and customer defection. Legacy airlines were retrofitting their training programs to match Skyline's standards. Low-cost carriers were marketing their dignity policies as competitive advantages. Regional airlines were partnering with major carriers specifically to access advanced bias prevention training. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation to influence other service industries. Hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and healthcare organizations were implementing modified versions of the Wellington Protocol after seeing its success in transforming corporate culture. Jake Anderson, whose live stream had first brought the Wellington incident to global attention, had become a documentary filmmaker focusing on corporate accountability. His film Dignity at Altitude had won awards at Sundance and Cannes, bringing even more attention to the importance of swift responses to discrimination. Victoria Coleman's leadership that day taught me that individual courage can create massive change, Anderson reflected during an interview with 60 Minutes. One woman's refusal to accept discrimination transformed an entire industry's approach to human dignity. Captain Wellington himself had become an unwitting symbol of how prejudice destroys careers. After losing his airline pilot license due to the discrimination incident, he had struggled to find employment in aviation. A year later, he was working as a ground instructor at a small flight school in Arizona, earning 1/10 of his former salary. Wellington's career trajectory demonstrates the real cost of bias, explained employment attorney David Kim during a legal conference. In today's interconnected world, discriminatory behavior creates permanent liability that follows individuals throughout their careers. Carmen Valdez, the gate agent who had initially discriminated against Victoria, had used her termination as an opportunity for self-reflection and growth. She had completed bias counseling, earned a degree in multicultural studies, and was now working as a diversity trainer for airport customer service companies. Losing my job was devastating. but it forced me to confront my prejudices, Valdez admitted during a conference presentation about learning from discrimination. Victoria Coleman's response to my behavior ultimately helped me become a better person. The academic study of the Wellington incident had produced dozens of research papers, case studies, and books about crisis leadership, corporate accountability, and rapid cultural transformation. Business schools worldwide were using Victoria's decision-making process as a template for ethical leadership under pressure. Judge Margaret Williams, who continued to chair Skyline's Passenger Dignity Review Board, had seen requests from other industries to establish similar accountability mechanisms. The review board model is proving that independent oversight can prevent discrimination more effectively than internal complaint processes. Victoria herself had become a sought-after speaker on corporate responsibility, cultural transformation, and moral leadership. However, she remained focused on operational excellence at Skyline rather than capitalizing on her media prominence. The goal was never personal recognition, Victoria explained during a keynote address at the National Urban League Conference. The goal was creating an environment where every passenger receives dignity, every employee feels respected, and every interaction reflects our values. The transformation of commercial aviation culture had occurred faster than anyone thought possible, proving that moral leadership could accelerate change when supported by clear policies, adequate resources, and unwavering commitment. The Wellington incident had revealed both the persistence of bias and the power of accountability to create rapid improvement. As other industries studied Skyline's transformation, Victoria Coleman's approach was being recognized not just as successful crisis management, but as a blueprint for any organization committed to turning discrimination incidents into opportunities for meaningful change. The legacy of Flight 847 would extend far beyond one aircraft, one airline, or even one industry, demonstrating that individual courage in moments of crisis could indeed transform entire cultures when that courage was backed by action, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. Victoria Coleman stood in her corner office on the 40th floor of Skyline Airways headquarters, looking out at the Chicago skyline as the sun set behind the Willis Tower. On her desk sat a simple black frame containing the boarding pass from Flight 847 Seat 2A, the seat she'd been denied, the seat that had sparked a revolution in airline accountability. Skyline Airways was now the most profitable airline in America, with customer satisfaction scores that exceeded every competitor. The company's stock price had tripled since the Wellington incident, making it one of the best-performing investments of the year. More importantly, discrimination complaints had virtually disappeared, replaced by testimonials from passengers who chose Skyline specifically because they trusted the airline to treat them with dignity. Michael Torres knocked on her office door carrying the quarterly diversity report. His transformation from flight attendant to vice president of passenger experience remained one of Victoria's proudest leadership decisions. Victoria, the numbers are remarkable. 0 confirmed discrimination incidents this quarter. Employee satisfaction at an all-time high. Customer loyalty metrics exceeding every projection. Victoria smiled, remembering the frightened flight attendant who had risked his career to document a captain's bias. Michael, those numbers represent more than business success. They represent cultural transformation. Through her window, she could see aircraft taking off from O'Hare International Airport, carrying passengers who would never know how close they had come to experiencing the discrimination that had once been endemic in commercial aviation. The Wellington Protocol had spread throughout the industry, making air travel more dignified for millions of people worldwide. Her assistant buzzed the intercom. "Victoria, you have a call from the White House. The President wants to discuss implementing the Coleman standards across all federal transportation programs." Victoria looked once more at the boarding pass on her desk, remembering the woman who had sat in a car outside a hotel 18 years ago, planning a business that would someday give her the power to demand dignity for everyone. That night in Atlanta, sleeping in her rental car because a hotel clerk didn't think she belonged in his establishment, Victoria had made herself a promise no one would ever make her feel invisible again. But somewhere along the journey from that car to this corner office, the promise had evolved. It wasn't enough to ensure her own dignity. She had to create operational protocols that protected everyone's dignity. The Wellington incident had tested everything she believed about leadership courage and the responsibility that came with power. Captain Wellington had seen a black woman in casual clothes and decided she didn't belong in first class. He had made assumptions based on appearances reinforced by 20 years of unchallenged prejudice. But Victoria had learned something profound that day. True strength wasn't about demanding respect. It was about ensuring that respect became so fundamental that demanding it was unnecessary. She had transformed not just an airline, but an understanding of what leadership meant in moments of moral crisis. Victoria's story had begun with humiliation and evolved into transformation, proving that dignity delayed was never dignity denied when someone with courage decided to act. The Wellington incident had demonstrated that individual moral courage could create massive change when backed by action, accountability, and unwavering commitment to justice. What did you think about Victoria's response to discrimination? Have you ever experienced a moment where someone tried to make you feel like you didn't belong, only to later realize you had more power than they ever imagined? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and your voice can inspire others who face similar challenges. If you believe that dignity should be standard for every traveler, every customer, and every human being, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs to see that justice is possible. Next week, we're bringing you the story of a restaurant owner who refused service to a homeless woman only to discover she owned the building where his restaurant operated. You don't want to miss that incredible tale of assumptions meeting consequences. Remember, respect isn't something you earn by proving your worth. It's something you deserve simply by existing. And when enough people understand that truth, the world changes one interaction at a time. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if Victoria's story inspired you, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss our latest stories of justice being served. Share this with your friends and family who believe in equal treatment for all people, because stories like this need to be heard by everyone. Your engagement helps these important messages reach more people who need to see that standing up for what's right always matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one, where dignity wins again.